Thanks, y'all. I know we're running a little bit behind schedule, and I'm not going to help, so get comfortable. My name is Greg Lesnewich. I work at a company called Proofpoint, and I work in our threat research organization, and my primary task is detecting, tracking, and disrupting North Korean threats targeting our customers. And today we're going to talk about the macOS malware that they're using in their cryptocurrency targeting. And in doing that, we're going to explore some methods that we've been tinkering with for finding similarity across their compiled macOS samples, Mach-Os. And to do so, we're going to look at the tooling from the three main actors we see doing revenue generation right now. And of course, along the way, share some of the secret sauce that we're using to track them. This talk is not off the record, so feel free to take screenshots, whatever. But there will be a couple of slides that I'll sort of raise my hand and be like, maybe don't take a photo of this one because one of the actors pays a lot of attention to the things that we put out there. So this talk builds on a lot of work from a lot of different people that deserve a ton of praise and thanks. But two people I do have to shout out are Jacob Latonis and Pim Schauerbach, who have been immensely helpful to me in this process. Getting into our subject today, North Korea, they have a very long history of doing some pretty interesting criminality things to stand up their nuclear weapons and missile programs. You can ask John Doyle all about them. Things like counterfeit cigarettes, drug sales. Then you move into the days of Bangladesh and SWIFT-style bank heists. Today's flavor of generating revenue for the regime is cryptocurrency theft. And we've seen a concerted effort from these groups to target macOS ecosystems because that is what the crypto entities are doing. The target is where the money is, and they're just going to adapt to that environment. And there's a weird sort of dual bias between us and the adversary where Apple marketing has gotten to them too, and they may think that Macs don't get viruses, and there's also inherently less threat intel and incident response data, and so they might discount how well we're able to track them, and I hope that we can take advantage of that. And the main things I want to get you to take away from this talk are that if you're sort of tepid, somewhat interested in stepping into the malware analysis side of all the forensics, I'd recommend doing it with macOS right now because it's a great time because there aren't a ton of obfuscation methods, so it's a good time to sort of get your feet wet. And that we shouldn't underestimate North Korea, and we shouldn't treat them as sort of a stepchild of the big four anymore because they're clever, they're innovative, they're advancing the field. If you saw anything about their FUD module rootkit, they are understanding and deeply going after the systems that we are using both on the Windows side and Mac OS. And finally, I wasn't aware of any real easy ways to pivot across and cluster Mach-O samples, so let's try and find some. Where this all started, we had to go back to March of this year and pull up some scar tissue when Jags and our beloved host at SentinelOne published about the 3CX supply chain incident. CrowdStrike also published, I think, on Reddit, which made for a much less pretty screenshot, with an attribution statement to their credit. And there was, then everybody in the industry had to chime in. It was a little bit of a mess. And there was a ton of analysis sort of happening in real time, particularly on the Windows side. And the Mac side was much less cool because all that really happened was a Trojanized dilib or dynamic library was injected into the 3CX installer. When that ran, that downloaded a payload from a C2 that called itself update agent. And on the Windows side, after a bunch of analysis, this got linked to an actor we track as Unk Juicehead. Everybody else calls him Apple Juice, so we'll stick with Apple Juice. There were a ton of sort of forensic artifacts to link it to Apple Juice, including a reused RC4 key only seen in Apple Juice intrusions, relatively rare shellcode in the SRDI shellcode stub. But on the Mac side, things were kind of underwhelming, partly because the update agent payload was just kind of boring. It wasn't really feature rich. All it would basically do is take a survey of the 3CX install and beacon to the C2. But because all that work was happening on the Windows side, I got a little curious to see, well, is there anything that we can do to link this to something North Korean? So how many of you are familiar with import hashing for Windows binaries? That's effectively what I wanted to find for Mac OS, sort of like an easy pivot style button. And I'm blatantly borrowing that idea, but we are talking about Apple, and so I think they should be comfortable with the idea of borrowing for innovation. Just ask them about Xerox. So I'm going to touch on a couple of macOS specific artifacts that might be worth our time to pivot on. The first are dilibs, which are a location-specific set of dependencies. And when they're loaded and referenced in each sample, they're full paths. They're not just a dilib name or a DLL name. So I thought that there might be some value there. And so if you take these dilibs and create a hash value from the update agent payload, and you do a similar thing across all the macOS malware families that I had access to, whether it's VX Underground, Malware Bazaar, Patrick Bortles, Corpus, and you do that over all those samples, the only samples that actually match that hash are previously attributed Apple Juice things, including PoolRat and an old thing called Crash Reporter. So I thought that was a pretty interesting way to pivot across them by sort of relying on these third-party dependencies. The second artifact to touch on is code signing flavors for macOS. There's two. There's ad hoc, which is self-signed, that includes this funny little hash-looking value at the end of it that we're going to ignore for the rest of the presentation because I don't fully understand it. And then a Apple authorized signature, which has a lot more metadata associated with it. But for our purposes, just the identifiers that are highlighted there in orange are going to be what we're going to focus on because I think that they can give us a little bit of insight into how the operators think about these families in their code base in the way that a DLL name or a PDB path might on the Windows side. Both types of certificates can also contain entitlements, which are basically requests to get out of the sandbox the Mach-O is running in and request data, features, or APIs from the operating system outside of the sandbox. So it can be another good thing to sort of anchor on if you're looking for features across a family. And so we're going to do a couple of other things as we sort of do a little bit of this similarity analysis. Lightweight, of course, with dilib hashing and pointing out the cert names, as well as doing some more familiar stuff to us, like hashing the imports and hashing the export names. And of course, because that's how these things go, I haven't seen much from Apple Juice on the macOS side since the 3CX incident. So we're going to get into a much more visible actor, TA444. You might know them as Blunerov or KG Chameleon. And they're really active. They're probably the most active group of the three we're going to talk about. They still do things as of this week to deploy the password.txt.lnk infection chain. It still works. I'm not sure why. On the macOS side, they're a little bit newer, but they have a couple of initial access methods, including Trojanized Python and Java packages, as well as the more direct PDF reader sort of phishing style campaigns. And as I mentioned, they're relatively new to the OS, so some of their methods are a little bit basic. They rewrite a lot of loaders and a lot of junk that don't really do anything. All they effectively do will either run curl or create a scriptlet file to run curl and download and execute next stage. Phil from S1 had a great blog on most of these that you can see the title for here. I'm not just kissing up to our sponsors and the hosts. This was actually the right blog to reference here. So go read that if you need hashes, because I'm going to kind of breeze right by them. The first of these was the PDF reader campaign that Jamf blogged about back in March of 2023. Unfortunately, this first blog and this first campaign was the most interesting because it would deliver a benign app file with an Apple scriptlet. That Apple scriptlet file would beacon to and download a second stage app file that would then decrypt the content with a 100-byte XOR key in a PDF already on disk. That then would display the lure content to the user, and then, of course, decrypt the next stage C2 address. And since then, they kind of have gone downhill. And the best example of this is probably a family we call SwiftLoad. I believe that one of these was referenced in Phil's blog. And all this sucker really does is create a scriptlet file to hit a URL with curl, unzip it, and run it. The problem that 444 ran into, though, is that that same scriptlet file is what's waiting at the URL. So if you just let it run, it's just going to loop endlessly as long as it can still resolve that URL. And so you might get the sense that this group is sort of learning macOS intrusions on the fly, just like me. So Hero Loader is where things actually start to get interesting for us, not because of any functionality. It's another boring intermediate loader. It can wipe files, so that's a big change to add a singular additional thing it can do. But how we can link it to other families, namely, if we exploring some of that hashing methodology we talked about before. Sorry that the lines are a little bit dark, but if we take something like the dilib hash, we can actually link it to Rust bucket and an older interception family called payroll loader. And if we take an export hash, we can get into the next family shared with a family we call Vanguard. When we found Vanguard, I have to admit we had pretty high fidelity linkages to 444 already based on C2 reuse. So we had a little bit of a cheat code there, but this one caught our attention because it actually used this new shiny thing called obfuscation, where when you run the app, because that's how it gets delivered as an app, it'll XOR the first 9 bytes of the last path component, which effectively is the file name that it's running as, with 3. That'll create another key that is used to decode a big chunk in the data section, where if you're looking at Mach-Os, that's a good place to find encrypted or unobfuscated next stage payloads. That, of course, is decrypted and becomes another Mach-O, the namesake Vanguard component. That's written to disk and executed. And when that runs, it grabs this obnoxiously padded stack string style buffer from its data section, which, of course, once it's decoded and runs, becomes another boring scriptlet file that just beacons to a TA444C2. So a little less fun than we'd hoped for. So we're going to get into a couple of their later stage backdoors. And those that there's public information about, I'm going to sort of breeze right by so we can talk about some of the ones that at least I don't have any public information about. The first of these is Rust Bucket that Jamf and Elastic both have really good blogs about. They added a persistence command over the summer, but effectively it's just another intermediate downloader that does a little bit of system profiling, written in a very obnoxious to analyze language. So this is one that gets an RE ticket the first time we saw it. Where it's interesting, though, is it does have a cousin that we found about a month ago called Cosmic Rust. This one uses WebSockets, the WebSocket Rust library instead of just HTTP. But it's a little confusing because it's like sort of like a stripped down version of Rust Bucket. And in sort of looking at all the previous loaders and then this sort of Rust segment of files that they have, it feels like there's like parallel development efforts, but not in the way that like the APTs that Juan talked about yesterday are doing parallel development, but like, hey, we're both learning Rust at the same time. Should we try and do the same project? And it is a little bit more stripped down. So it does have some good network artifacts that you can pivot on to go find more of it, but we've actually only seen very limited samples of these. The next family is Joker Spy that, again, already previously covered by Bitdefender and Elastic. Their work on it is really good, particularly how they talk about the tampering and sort of fingerprinting of the TCC database. We actually couldn't link this based on like any code or sort of the similarity hashing to anything else. This one was purely based on the delivery method through the Python, a Trojanized Python application, as well as some infrastructure overlap if you got really deep into the subdomains that it used. So let's get into a more better backdoor than what we've seen from this group before. It's a family we call Sock Racket, and it behaves a lot more like a backdoor family that you'd hope to see from an adversary like this. It can do all the commands that you see on the screen, upload, download files, execute commands, all that sort of fun stuff. Where it gets cool is it has a custom protocol to beacon back and forth to the C2 that uses a socket and is wrapped in RC4. The benefit for us is that much like rolling your own crypto, rolling your own protocol can be a bad idea. And there is an RC4 key encrypted or passed in plain text during that handshake. And when I passed the encrypted PCAP to Pim Trauerbach on our team, Pim eyeballed it and basically said, oh yeah, there's a static key exchange, we can decrypt it. Within 2 minutes of me sending him the PCAP without having the binary yet. So Pim, where's the camera, you freak? Thank you. This is what a command issuance for the basic host info command looks like. And then some of the exfiltrated data. It's not anything crazy, but it is something, and proof that Pim is a wizard. And I've sort of mentioned like getting in early when the developers aren't super well versed in obfuscation or macOS malware necessarily. And one of the Sock Racket's a good example of that because it's pretty feature rich, but they don't strip symbols yet. So you can see that they leave in the labels for their RC4 keys just in the binary. So it made me not have to submit a reverse engineering ticket. I could do it all myself, which felt pretty good because they nicely labeled everything for you. But in the event that they change that, all of the samples have actually had the same dilib hash and this same MAC-T signature name, which we hope can be a useful way to find it if they learn how to strip symbols. And of course, a couple days before this presentation, which is why I had to resubmit my slides 3 times, is that we found a cousin of it, or what we think is a cousin of it, called Spectral Blur. Because it's another family that uses sort of this proc style, these proc style function names, and uses a custom protocol over sockets wrapped in RC4. Where it gets weird, though, is that this the binary that is publicly available was actually downloaded from a TA444C2 that in February of this year was used to download a component linked to interception that called itself GetInfoWeb. So that's sort of just a way to segue into the fact that infrastructure really is the best way to keep track of these folks. So if you're a fan of Census or Shodan like I am, you can really mine out a lot of stuff to find them. And they have some pretty generic fingerprints that you can use, like combinations of OpenSSL. They have some, I'm blanking on the Windows Server types that they're using. But if you look for sort of those generic fingerprints in places like Hostwinds or Nexion or Chupa, you'll probably find them, and the domains that resolve to them can be a pretty dead giveaway. And I do have to say that tracking this group is supremely easy if you have the new VirusTotal network-based Yara stuff, because it makes finding stuff downloaded from and communicating with these C2s very, very easy to just get right into your inbox in an alert. So it makes that pivoting process a lot easier. So we're going to go from easy mode to hard mode and probably get into the toughest group to track. This is the one where there will be a couple of network screenshots of how we're tracking their infrastructure, where you can take photos, but please don't tweet them, because they do pay attention to these things. This group has been around for a pretty long time, and they're very well versed in the Mac malware space. And to be honest, part of the reason I wanted to come to LABScon and talk about them is that we can see the ripples in the water, but maintaining direct visibility of them has been really, really difficult. So it's sort of trying to get the community involved with what we know, and hopefully you guys can add something to that story. We call them MachoMan. I get to have fun with our UNC names because our TA designation numbers are literally 3 numbers. So you might know them as Trader or UNC 4899 from Mandiant's excellent Jump Cloud report. As I mentioned, they're very well versed in the Mac malware space, and they have a couple of mainstay backdoors that have been around a long time to be aware of. The first of them is Beefeater, that has a gazillion names, and these are, I think, legitimately only half of them that I was able to fit on the screen. Of course, like most of these other Mac malware families, Phil from SentinelOne was the first one to find it back in 2018 when it was delivered as a fake, a Trojanized application or a fake application. And over the years, it's been prevalent on both the Windows and Mac side. Previously, it was effectively a tunneler, and now it's evolved into a backdoor with some tunneling functionality. The Beefeater name came from the 4-byte handshake that was used to beacon to connect to the C2 to initiate those comms that looked a lot like Beefeater. The nice thing for people like me that like the internet scan data stuff is that those bytes were also present on the listeners. So if you sat around and just had a query looking for those 4 bytes on Census Shodan, you had a pretty good chance that you were finding their C2s. And it made it really easy to keep track of the prevalence or potential volume of their operations without necessarily having direct visibility in your own network or telemetry. The problem we ran into is that in 2022, that pattern changed, and the handshake changed, at least on the Windows side, and then servers started dwindling and falling off the map. And so if you combine that with not seeing any macOS samples for a little while, and then the servers going offline, frankly, we lost sight of them. But then we had a sighting from the Mandiant Jump Cloud report. The full house rule that they published actually hits all the old publicly available macOS Beefeater samples and a couple of non-public ones, which provide a pretty high fidelity link. And the sample that they found actually used that same Mac signature name that I believe they found in the XProtect Behavioral Services database. So it can be another good place if you are in the forensic side of the house to go look for these weird ad hoc signature names. Austin, who worked the Jump Cloud IR case for me, has been very, very helpful and forthcoming. And the tooling that we're going to publish later, he went to try and run on the full house YAR on the full house sample. And I thought I was going to get up here and be like, look, they used the same dilib hash for the last 6 years. It didn't work. So I want to be transparent about the methodology and say that, like, hey, we're trying something, we're throwing it at the wall, and if it works, we hope that we can keep using it. And if you want to explore the original sample, it still has all the symbols intact. If you just Google iContact.package, you'll find it. And pulling that sample down and analyzing it is pretty easy. So let's get to the behemoth of theirs. Mata, probably my personal favorite malware of the bunch. NetLab360 originally found it, and I sort of view this as Trader's crown jewel of these macOS and Windows side, frankly, intrusions because of how extendable it is and how much it can do to facilitate a compromise. If you've noticed sort of the boxes here at the bottom, Not a lot of the families have had anything in the persistence realm. Mata actually is, if it has high enough privileges, it can persist as a launch daemon. And if the privileges are a little bit lower, it will persist as a launch item, which is already pretty rare for Mac malware. But it's also modular and plugin based. And so it has all this extendo functionality to load a reverse shell, upload, download files, all the typical backdoor things. It can also do some like custom scanning on the host to find particular files, so it's pretty extensible in that manner. I would imagine that over time they can add plugins. I think the coolest one, though, is the reverse peer-to-peer, the RP2P function or plugin there, to effectively chain infections across a compromised network in the way that I think all of the malware families that some of us have admired at one point in our time, like Snake or Carbon, where this is really becoming a platform to sort of tunnel and burrow deeper into a victim network. It does this via another custom protocol, which, at least when I was building my slides, looked really pretty in the LABScon template, but now it's a little bit washed out. But this is pretty extensive. And there was a little bit of a weakness in it, though, like SockRocket, where that, not in the same way to decrypt communications, but if you blasted this 4-byte check-in to every server on the internet, any server that responded with that 4-byte response was probably a Mata server. So keeping track of this with sort of your own scanning methods was pretty easy. However, if you're like me and you run into scaling or repetition issues, or not really working well with ZMap or Python to do it repeatedly on sort of a cron basis over and over, it got easy to lose sight of, as well as some of the servers had some TLS handling issues of all things, so it also was pretty easy to lose sight of unless you were a guy called Takahiro from VMware, who is maybe one of my favorite researchers on the planet. I see Silas giving 2 thumbs up. And he's done it for a few other families. We should go read all of his stuff because it's amazing. But doing network emulation of Mata all the way down past the RC4 key exchange, into command issuance. And when he published this blog at the end of 2022, he published IOCs with it. And if you paid attention, 2 of those servers were actually still live. And if you modeled those and fingerprinted those servers, you actually could develop a pretty high fidelity signature. Obviously, this VirusTotal interface wasn't around yet, so you'd use something like Census, but the screenshot just didn't look as good. And if you sat on that signature long enough, you'd find hits in your Mata collect popping up in places like the Circle CI incident report from earlier this year. And like Tom's blog on some of the stuff mentioned, you would also then find servers in your collection popping up places like the JumpCloud internal incident report this year, not the Mandiant blog, a blog that JumpCloud published. And so I focus heavily on the infrastructure side for this group because that's pretty much all that we can track them with right now. We, or at least I, don't have good direct visibility of where Mata is being deployed right now. Part of that is, I work for an email company, but I'm lacking any recent samples. Kaspersky has written about the fact that they saw a rewrite of the Mata framework to v5 on the Windows side. I think in their Q2 or Q3 APT update this year. So it's obviously still active, and I think that sort of pairs well with the infrastructure tracking to hopefully validate that we're not wrong here. But this is sort of a little bit of a call to action that if you see Mata, pursue it in your networks, burn it to the ground. They're helping their not so great leader build nukes, so stop it. And if you find it, you can also tell me. I'd be very appreciative. Trader actually uses a couple of other very interesting macOS families that I don't have time to go into today. Tie-dye, which is, if you loosen the YAR rule, looks like a variant of manuscript, which is like the backbone of DPRK intrusions, and a family called Stratosphere that we suspect is actually written by the Mata devs. Modular, multi-architecture. You should go read their blog, Mandiant's blog about it. They're bullying me because there are 18 of them here that said, you have to talk about the JumpCloud blog 18 times. And it's modular and it can do all these cool things, so I'd recommend to go check it out, maybe for a LABScon presentation next year. And as we wrap up, this is sort of the mind map that I have of where we were when a bunch of these cyber intrusions started with the Bangladesh bank heist and where we sort of started, and how a bunch of those groups and families have degraded and then sort of recoalesced into the families that we see today. And in looking at Mach-O Similarity, I'm pretty proud of myself for getting to almost the end of my talk without talking about Yara. But one of the challenges that we had, I think, in pivoting across these things is a lot of these things aren't entitized or transcribed as features or extracted in an easy way to pivot across them. I know if you look in VirusTotal, each dilib uniquely is pulled out, but opening each one and sort of concatenating into a search can be a little bit difficult. And so the easiest way to hunt on these things, unfortunately, is to write a decently extensive rule like this that also requires you to at least run something like Binary Refinery's Mach-O meta module on it, or dump strings, which at that point, most of us that do import hash pivoting, it's a single button click as soon as we see the sample, not trying to be too intensive. So it feels like a little bit of a waste of a retro hunt right now. We tried a bunch of different methods initially that failed, like hashing bytes at the entry point, finding the entry point, looking at the mod init functions that all ended up being kind of useless. And so we've published code today. Code is in quotes here for a good reason. It is very much a POC to sort of do some of this dilib hashing as well as hash of the imports to the exports and pull out the signature name. It's not perfect, partly because I wrote it. So please use it, abuse it. I'm hoping that we can sort of treat this as something that we could grow into, or at least be an idea for how we can sort of attack Similarity in Mach-O malware families. I haven't scaled it, so VT and Malware Bazaar are both aware of it. I'm not sure if anything's going to happen with that. So if anyone from Stairwell is in here, now's your chance to get ahead of the game of them, because I know you love doing that. But it's written. There's two variants of the tool. One's written in Python. One's written in a tool called Ktool, which are basically just if you have one of them already installed, it's just easier to use them that way. And I should say this again, that I haven't scaled it. So I have a coworker called Jacob Latonis, who I am paying a $1,000 bounty to write a C parser for this, so we can eventually implement it and then hopefully push it into Yara or something else that is sort of in the general lexicon of what we're using versus just some random dude's GitHub profile that's hosting the code. I realize I've gone over time, and now the counter is counting up. But to wrap up, there isn't much in the realm of persistence for North Korean Mac malware right now, and I really don't expect that to change, because as soon as they can access funds, they're going to run off with them. And they can, because of how much we've historically focused on the Windows side of the house, there's a little bit of a blind spot there. But where I actually see things going is more in payload hardening, whether that means that random researchers like me can't peel payloads off their C2s, or that they're just going to introduce more obfuscation or at least start stripping symbols. So as I've said, and Phil from S1, who I'm not sure if he's here, I think has mentioned extensively, it's a good time to get involved in Mac malware. And so I realize I'm running to everyone's lunch. I have hashes if anybody wants them. But thank you so much for attending my talk. Enjoy lunch, and more importantly, enjoy the rest of LABScon. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much.